Hi guys, I'm Tequila Mockingbird, and welcome back to The Path of Flame by Yodepalma. Chapter 8, Lasting Impressions. They all received notes from Hagrid at breakfast the morning Norbert hatched. Harry met Hermione in Neville's eyes across the Great Hall, but Hermione just shook her head at him. She obviously wasn't going to skip her morning class, even for something as rare as getting to see a dragon hatch. Draco, of course, had no such problems. Harry had barely finished chewing when his friend had dragged him away from the table, telling Blaise and Pansy to take really good notes in history of magic, as if any of them were going to be awake long enough to take notes, because they were going to be busy all morning. The others knew better than to ask what Harry and Draco were up to, especially when Draco impatiently shooed Crabbe and Goyle off to class, instead of allowing the two larger boys to accompany them as he usually did. Hagrid let them into his hut with a tremendous grin, clearly too nervous to realise that the two of them must be skipping class, and asked where Hermione and Neville were. He didn't seem to think much of it when Harry said the other two would be down later, as he just ushered the two Slytherins over to the table the large black dragon egg was sitting on. It had a crack running down it, and they could hear the dragon moving inside. "Is it going to get out on its own?" Draco asked anxiously, leaning so close to the egg that Hagrid pulled him back by the collar. "How long does it take?" "Might be hours yet," Hagrid said gruffly, poking at the fire and offering them tea. "If he's not out by lunch, I'm going to give him a bit of a hand. The mothers crack 'em open if they can't do it themselves, but I don't think he'll have a problem." Draco and Harry nodded, absent-mindedly accepting the teacups Hagrid had given them. Harry was so focused on the widening cracks in the egg it took him several minutes to realise that Hagrid had forgotten to put the tea leaves into the cup. Draco still hadn't noticed, and was peacefully sipping at the hot water with his eyes glued to the table. Hagrid was no better, fitfully wringing his beard and looking like a father expecting his first baby. With a heavy sigh, Harry got up from his seat and started poking around at the cupboards. He had to climb on the counter to get out the tea, but he successfully managed to make himself a proper cup. Draco swatted him away when he tried to take his friend's cup, so he just sighed and let the other boy drink his hot water. Waiting for the dragon to hatch was extremely boring. While his friends seemed perfectly happy to stare at the egg and discuss the minuscule cracks that appeared as the baby dragon tried to get out, Harry quickly lost interest and found himself grateful that he had his school bag with him. He dug out some homework that he planned on finishing in History of Magic, and worked on it until another knock on the door interrupted Draco and Hagrid's hushed conversation. "It's nearly out," Hagrid said in excitement as he let Neville and Hermione in, and Harry was crowded as the two Gryffindors dropped their bags and joined them at the table. He inspected the egg as he put his homework away. The cracks were much deeper, and the clicking noises of the dragon hammering on the inside were much louder than before. He was surprised he hadn't noticed sooner. A few minutes after the two Gryffindors joined them, the egg finally shattered. The baby dragon flopped out onto the table, looking rather like a crumpled umbrella. Its spiny wings were at least twice the size of its skinny body, and it had stubby little horns and bulging orange eyes. When it sneezed, a couple of sparks flew out of its snout. "Isn't he beautiful?" Hagrid murmured, reaching out a hand to stroke it. The dragon snapped at him with his tiny, sharp fangs. "Bless him, he knows his mummy," Hagrid said. Hagrid?" Hermione asked. "How fast do Norwegian ridgebacks grow exactly?" Turns out that Norwegian ridgebacks grew at an alarming speed. Within a week, the dragon, which Hagrid had decided to call Norbert, was 3 times the size he'd been when he'd hatched, and was getting more and more vicious by the day. Neither Hagrid nor Draco seemed to notice this, though. Hagrid cooed over the dragon as if it was an adorable human baby, telling it bedtime stories and singing it lullabies. Draco wasn't quite that bad, but he did manage to produce a faded red dragon plushie from somewhere that he solemnly gave to Norbert one day after making Harry swear he wouldn't tell anybody. Draco would later admit that that plushie was a holdover from his childhood. Strangely enough, it was named Flame, and had absolutely no relation whatsoever to the Flame Alchemist. Harry was still going to tell his dad that he had a toy named after him. Hermione and Neville didn't fare nearly as well with the creature. They were both extremely cautious with Norbert, wary of his sharp fangs and his habit of accidentally snorting fire when he was excited. But that didn't keep them away from a few near misses. Harry strongly suspected Norbert, like most animals, could smell their fear, and had rightfully put them into the category of prey. It wouldn't have been so bad, but Neville attracted disaster like nobody Harry had ever seen. By the end of the week, the boy was visiting the hospital wing with a nasty-looking bite on his arm that looked like it had a touch of venom to it. "I don't know why Malfoy likes that thing so much," Neville complained, and he and Hermione frowned at Harry as if he had anything to do with Draco's strange taste in animals. "That thing's vicious." "We need to convince Hagrid to get rid of him," Hermione said fretfully, giving Harry a wide-eyed look. Harry wasn't sure what she wanted him to do. They'd already tried to talk Hagrid into giving Norbert up, but the man had argued that the baby was too little to be let loose, which wasn't wrong, of course, but Harry was starting to worry that they were going to get caught, and Hagrid would be sent to jail. "I don't know why Hagrid thinks that a dragon has any predators in Scotland," Neville said grumpily, though he had to know one as young as Norbert would be snapped up by something in the Forbidden Forest in a second. "We can't keep doing this." "Did somebody say dragon?" a voice interrupted as a pair of identical faces peered around the privacy curtain that separated Neville's bed from the rest of the wing. Hermione and Neville paled dramatically, but Harry jumped to his feet with his wand in hand, narrowing his eyes. "We didn't know Hagrid had a dragon," the other twin said with a pout. "And after all the time we've spent together, the hours in detention, the evenings being chased away from the forest—" "You're Ron Weasley's brothers, aren't you?" Harry interrupted, steadily pointing his wand at them. "What do you want?" "Well, we couldn't help but overhear your dilemma," twin number 1 stated. "You really need to be more discreet," number 2 continued with a wink. "And we thought we could offer our services," the first twin concluded with a bow. "Or, well, more accurately, our older brother's services. He's studying dragons, you see. I bet he'd love to get a ridge back in the sanctuary." "And what do you get in return?" Harry asked suspiciously. "Suspicious little thing, aren't you?" the second twin asked, and didn't seem impressed by Harry's responding scowl. "Oh, come on. How often do you think we ever get to see a real live dragon? Let us help you get rid of the thing, and we'll call it even. Anyway, can't hurt to say we're friends with Harry Potter now, can it? Besides, you don't seem too bad for a Slytherin," the first twin added thoughtfully. "And we don't have a contact in that house yet, so maybe we'll ask you for a favour someday." "I've heard of you two," Harry said warily. "Fred and George, right? The pranksters. Everyone's warned me to stay away from you two and Lee Jordan. I don't like the thought of being in your debt." "You really are delightfully suspicious," twin number 2 said with an amused voice. "I'm Fred, he's George. I promise we don't bite unless you ask." "I'm way too young to worry about biting," Harry informed them without really thinking about it, mentally filing Fred and George's distinguishing characteristics. It wasn't easy, since the two were nearly identical, but George's ears were a little bit bigger, and Fred had a strangely distinct pattern of freckles under his left eye. George grinned at him, a little too wide to be pleasant, and Harry blushed, realising what he'd just said. He really needed to stop channeling his dad. "And feisty too," George cooed, laughing when Harry glared at him. "It's okay, I promise. We're harmless." "Mostly harmless," Fred amended with a smirk. "So, what do you say? Want a hand?" Harry turned the offer over in his head. Fred and George seemed sincere enough, for all the jokes and inappropriate flirting, and Harry didn't really have any other ideas. He really didn't like the idea of owing them a favour, though. "Okay," he said eventually, "but no favours. Or at least nothing I can't deny. I don't want to be implicated in any of your tricks. My dad'll kill me if I get into too much trouble." "Deal," George said quickly, as if he was worried Harry would change his mind. "We'll send Charlie and Owl tonight. Ta!" And the Weasley twins skipped off, arm in arm. "Are you sure that's a good idea, Harry?" Hermione asked timidly, and Harry tucked away his wand as he turned back to his friends. They were both giving him worried looks, Neville also having the grace to look apologetic. "What if they tell the teachers on us?" "I don't think they will," Harry said, more confidently than he felt. "I think they're too excited about seeing a real dragon. Anyway, I guess we'll know soon enough, won't we?" Hermione and Neville shared a frown, but Harry just shook his head and their concerns off. "I have to tell Draco. Could you talk to Hagrid, Hermione?" He waited for Hermione to give her reluctant agreement before he left, making a beeline for the dungeons to let Draco know what was happening. He found his friend sprawled on one of the couches in front of the fire, holding court with his friends. Blaise looked bored, because Blaise always looked bored. But when Pansy saw him coming, her eyes widened with relief. She mouthed something that looked suspiciously like "Save us" at Harry. Grinning, Harry approached his friends to catch Draco on the end of a tale story about saving his house elf from a pack of superstitious muggles. As if elves needed saving. "Did you know it's illegal for muggles to burn people at the stake now?" Harry interrupted, giving the back of Draco's head a sharp poke. His friend turned to sulkily glare at him. "And they probably would have assumed your elf had a medical condition and left him alone. This is the 20th century, you know." "What do you want?" Draco sneered, utterly ignoring every word Harry said. "Oh, I needed to tell you something," Harry replied casually, pulling some imaginary lint off the sleeve of his robes. "But please, finish your wildly inaccurate story first. I'm sure it can wait." "There's no point in finishing it now," Draco grumbled. "Do I have to get up for this?" "Yep," Harry said without an ounce of guilt. "Is anyone in the dorms?" "No, I think Not's in the library or something," Draco said, waving his hand vaguely as he got up from the couch. He followed Harry up the stairs to their dorm quietly, throwing himself on his bed as soon as they reached it, and giving Harry an impatient look. Harry climbed onto his bed as well, sitting cross-legged at Draco's knees, but hesitated to tell him the news. "I think we found a way to get Norbert somewhere safe," he said eventually, pretending not to notice the way his friend's face fell. "I was talking to Neville and Hermione in the hospital wing, and, Fred and George Weasley overheard us." "You accepted help from them!" Draco yelped, sitting up and giving Harry's leg a sharp smack. "You can't trust them. Our families have been at odds for years." "You're so dramatic," Harry grumbled, rubbing his sore leg. "One of the brothers works with dragons or something. They're sending him a letter. They just seem to think it's cool knowing a real dragon." "Or they've discovered an easy way to get a pair of Slytherins into serious trouble, and they're taking it," Draco countered. But Harry just shook his head. "Hagrid would be in more trouble than any of us, and they seem to really like him," he said. "Anyway, they already know, so there's nothing we can do about it now. We'll just have to wait and see what happens." What happened was that Harry received an owl from the twins a week later, letting him know that their older brother Charlie had agreed to take Norbert. Draco made a dismayed sound after reading their request to be allowed to help carry the dragon up to the top of the astronomy tower. But Harry pointed out that it would be heavy work for a pair of first years. Norbert was still a baby, but he was getting bigger and bigger by the day, and more wild too. Harry worried what might happen if the dragon suddenly took a dislike to the crate while they were at the top of the stairs. At least the Weasley twins were beaters on the house team, and presumably had quite a bit of muscle built up that Harry and Draco were lacking. Saturday night, Draco and Harry met Hermione at the front door of the school, and the three of them went down to Hagrid's together. Hagrid had already had Norbert crated up for his trip when they got there, and the giant man gave them a watery smile that made them all uncomfortable. "I've packed his teddy bears in case he gets lonely," he assured them tearfully, either not noticing or ignoring the distinct sound of stuffed animals being torn apart coming from inside the crate. Draco glared at the box and grumbled something about the dragon he'd given Norbert that had Harry stifling a grin. Harry shifted impatiently as Hagrid cried over the crate, saying goodbye to Norbert, his eyes glued to his watch. They still had to meet up with the twins by the entrance hall. Not that Hagrid knew they were involved tonight. Finally, Draco and Harry managed to get themselves and the crate beneath the cloak, and they left behind an anxious Hermione as they made their way back to the school. It was exhausting work, carrying a live animal while trying to make sure that none of their body or any parts of the crate escaped the confines of the cloak. It took them longer than Harry would have liked to sneak their way back inside. "So, keep Filch busy in the dungeons tonight for us, yeah?" Fred, or was it George, was asking someone as they pushed their way back into the castle. Harry almost dropped his half of the crate when he saw Peeves the poltergeist bobbing upside down in the air in front of the twins, smiling at them like he'd already gotten away with murder. Fortunately, it seemed as if Peeves must be fond of the twins, because he just gave the two of them an eager nod before zooming off, singing a rude song. "That you, Harry?" George asked a second later, turning in their direction. His gaze fell a distinct half-foot from Harry's left, and Harry grinned widely when the older boy jumped as he pulled the cloak down from his face. "Is that an invisibility cloak?" Fred asked with bright eyes, stepping around his twin and patting the air by Harry's shoulder. "Were you really planning to take the dragon up the tower under that?" George continued, crowding Harry's other shoulder. Harry made a face at both of them and leant back, trying to regain some personal space. "Well, do you have a better plan?" he asked grumpily, adjusting his grip on the crate's handle, which was starting to slip in his sweaty grip. "It'd be hard not to notice us." "Well, there are spells to help," George said. "And we've got the map," Fred added. "Hey, why don't you let us carry him?" George added. "You look beat already." "Can we just get a move on?" Draco asked from the other side of the crate. "I prefer feeding the beast to lugging it around this godforsaken castle, and I'd like to get some sleep tonight." "Aye, that's not Hermione," Fred said, sounding genuinely surprised. Harry sighed as Draco abruptly put his side of the crate down and tore the cloak over his own head and glared at the twins. "No, I bloody well am not," he snarled. "She couldn't fit under the cloak with us, and with the crate, okay? Now, are we going to get this done, or should I just call up Professor Snape myself and get us all detentions?" "He's got a point, Fred. Check the map," George said, pulling out his wand. His twin grumbled, but pulled out a ratty-looking piece of parchment and made a show of looking it over. "Here, Harry, let me and Fred carry your dragon, and we can get it up faster. No offence, but you two are kind of scrawny." "But how are you going to hide yourselves?" Harry asked worriedly, even if he swiftly uncovered the crate. George just winked at him in reply, then bent over the crate, giving it a sharp rap that echoed down the hall. Harry watched as the box quickly disappeared from view as the surroundings were melting over it. "That's a mute-level spell," Draco said, sounding impressed despite himself. "Worked it out the beginning of this year," Fred said proudly, strolling over and thrusting the parchment he'd been looking at into Harry's hand. To Harry's surprise, it was a detailed map of Hogwarts. 4 tiny pairs of feet were crowded around the entrance, each one labelled with its name. Harry gawked. "The Marauder's map," George said warmly, pointing to a pair of feet some distance off. "Looks like Filch is heading in this direction." "You two get under the cloak and take the map," Fred said, "and keep an eye out for danger, okay?" "Okay," Harry said vaguely, eagerly tracking his eyes over the map as Draco got back under the cloak on his own. Fred and George hit each other on the heads with their wand, and Harry hoped that it was only because he knew they were there that he didn't have any trouble tracking their movements. Either way, he slipped the cloak back over his own head and led the way out of the hall, hoping to keep ahead of Filch. With Fred and George now shouldering the awkward weight of the dragon, the trip to the tallest tower didn't take quite as much time as it would have otherwise. With the map to assure them that no one was around to get them in trouble, it wasn't even as stressful as it might have been otherwise, so they were all in good spirits while they waited for Charlie's friends to show up. Harry tried to ask the twins about the map, but was sorely disappointed to discover that they didn't really know much about it or the people who made it. Apparently, they'd dug it out of one of Filch's cabinets that year, and had been using it to get around with great effect since. But that was all they knew about it. Charlie's friends showing up took Harry's mind almost entirely off the map. They were quite cheerful, especially given the time of night, and showed them all the harness that they'd made to suspend Norbert between them as they flew. They were even quite tolerant of Draco's incessant questions, never seeming to run out of patience despite the blonde's less than humble attitude. But finally they had to leave, and Draco gave the crate one last fond pat to say goodbye to Norbert, before they were watching the figures dwindling off into the night sky. "I guess that's that then," Draco said sadly, rubbing his eyes like they itched. "A real dragon, though," George said wistfully. "Charlie's always had all the luck," George said ruefully. Harry handed the map back over to Fred as they started down the stairs without any further commentary. They'd only just gotten to the foot of the first flight when a soft light and the sound of a stern voice had them shuffling back into the shadows hastily. Harry pulled the cloak tighter around himself and Draco instinctively. "But you don't understand, Professor," Ron Weasley was saying as he was being dragged down the hallway by the ear by Professor McGonagall. "I overheard my brothers talking. Potter and Malfoy have a dragon." "A dragon?" Professor McGonagall scoffed. "What utter rubbish! I'd expect you of all people to know not a word that comes out of your brothers' mouths." She kept ranting at Ron as she pulled him down the hallway, but thankfully her voice soon faded into the darkness. Harry and Draco shared a grin. There was no way Ron was avoiding detention for this. "And that's our baby brother, eh?" Fred said with a mournful shake of his head. "What kind of a Weasley sneaks off instead of confronting his family?" "We'd better get going before McGoogles comes back looking for us, though," George said. "Lovely working with you boys. Don't be strangers." Fred and George took off silently, and even without the disillusionment charms, they disappeared into the shadows between one blink and the next. So that was Chapter 8 of The Path of Flame. I just want to say a quick thank you if you have been holding on and listening to these, even though it's been quite some time since I last uploaded. Hopefully I will get some sort of schedule started on the uploads of these things, but I've been getting really distracted by everything, really. So yeah, thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you again in the next episode, which will be Chapter 9,